This is Cinema Activist, the official podcast of Lion's Den Productions, for filmmakers and cinephiles who crave context. So my guest today is Tara Ang. Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this.
So I watched your film On the Fenceline, A Fight for Clean Air, which I found to be an extremely inspiring short film. You know, another one of those stories that shows that the struggle is real and industry affects real people in the world, and they are out there fighting and clawing and biting and shouting right to anyone that will listen of the injustices that are going on in their communities, and trying to get the word out and make change in their communities. So the story is, it follows a South Philadelphia community as they mobilize to shut down all operations of the East Coast's largest oil refinery, which is literally in their backyard, right?
Yeah, literally right across the street there. It's crazy that you can see the towers just looming over from the windows of your backyard.
Yeah, it's such an ominous image, and can't imagine people living with that and living with the repercussions every day in their lives. Before we get into On the Fenceline, let's learn a little bit about Tara. Are you from Philadelphia? Where did you get into filmmaking? Where did you get your start? And I guess, how did this story come across your radar?
Yeah. So I am not from Philadelphia, but I'm from the suburbs of Philadelphia. So I'm 30 minutes out. But, grew up going to the city when I was in high school. Obviously took a lot of trips into the city with my friends. But the refinery was certainly never on my radar. But I'll get into that in a moment. But I had always been interested in storytelling. So I was a writer first. I was very interested in journalism, and also photography. And when I was looking at schools, I don't really think I knew that I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. But I knew I didn't want to just be a writer. At the time, my impression of what journalism was White House press coverage, which wasn't super appealing to me, but maybe just shows how narrow-minded you are at, 17, 18 years old. So I found a college that had a documentary program that had film courses and journalism courses. And I was like, oh, that sounds like, I could dip my toes into both. If I don't like it, they have a journalism program. I can go there.
Which college was this?
Ithaca College.
Ithaca.
Yes, in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So I got in. I went, and then the first semester I was there, I realized that this was what I wanted to do. And that is really how I kind of fell into filmmaking. Definitely, I was more of a producer type than anything else. I love, talking to people and working behind the scenes, but I am not much of the holder of the camera myself. But yeah, that is kind of how I got started.
All right. So you said you liked writing, and it sounds like you always had an interest in politics. So I'm curious, what kind of a writer were you in grade school, and how did that maybe morph and change over time, and why the interest in politics?
I don't think I knew that I was really interested in politics at the time, but it was around me. I mean, constantly, because I remember my high school senior year, I took this course called Contemporary Issues, and it was the only class that I'd really been able to engage in issues myself, other than just at home. My parents had the news on all the time. So I was exposed to it. I didn't really have space to make sense of it myself, though. And writing for me was a way of kind of I obviously wrote nonfiction, but I like edged more towards personal essay, observational kind of stuff.
Okay.
And through that, I started to understand like what are my worldviews and what do I believe and how am I processing what the world is throwing at me.
Okay, so that's obviously where the documentary and the journalistic instincts come from. Observing, wanting to tell other people's stories, finding an angle through the interests that got you excited. What got you interested specifically in South Philadelphia and this project?
When the refinery exploded, that was the first time that it really was put on my radar.
Yeah.
I mean,
Hard to
driving into
ignore.
the city, exactly, very hard to ignore. And when you go into Philly, I mean, you see that the refinery is there, obviously. But I mean, I never really thought twice about the impact on what that, the impact of like the refinery on the community. But when the refinery exploded, I was living in North Carolina at the time.
Okay.
Yes, and I had my partner was living in New York, so I would once a month fly up to New York to see him. And the morning that the refinery exploded, I was literally flying right over it.
Oh wow. Really?
Yeah.
That's
And when
crazy.
I landed, yeah, it was really wild because I was shut off for 2 hours. And when I woke up, my phone was just flooding with notifications like, did you hear this happen? Did you see this fire? Look at this crazy video. Like, what happened in Philadelphia? And that I think is pretty representative of just like my relationship to what the refinery had been. Like, I'd always kind of just been flying by or just driving by and not really realizing how massive it was. And once that happened and I realized that it was there and that the, you know, shrapnel getting thrown into people's yards from that explosion, it was impossible to ignore after that. And I kept following the story as it unfolded, you know, as PES went bankrupt, as community members started coming to these open city hearings, and that is really like how I eventually was like, okay, well, something is happening here. I want to go find out what is going on. You know, there was this picture at one of the community hearings. Actually, let me back up a little bit. So at the time that all this was unfolding, I actually went back to school. So I was
Okay.
watching this unfold from a distance.
In
Um,
North Carolina you were in school?
I was in Ithaca, New
Oh,
York.
Ithaca. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. Sorry.
Yes. No, that's okay. So as this was unfolding, I was in school, so I was paying attention to coverage, and the city had started hosting these open forum hearings where they had a city advisory panel, just to hear from the community, from union workers who are now getting laid off about what they wanted the future of the refinery to be. And in one of the articles, there was a photo of this woman. Her name was Sylvia Bennett. And she had her arms out and she had these bright yellow earrings that were made of peace signs and this bright yellow shirt that said Philly Thrive. And you could tell that like her face, she was just in anguish over this. And that was an image that stuck with me. And that is when I knew that I wanted to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Let's this may be backtracking, but we'll see, only because I don't know the history of the production company. So you're in a group called Picture to Picture Productions. So whether we want to jump into the origins of that and maybe if that relates to this project, I guess sticking with the South Philadelphia story. So you're seeing a lot of this on the news, you're seeing these images. So do you you know, as a one-woman show at that point, say, okay, I want to start somehow following this story, being a fly on the wall, seeing what's going on in a more involved capacity? How did you take that leap from being the student in Ithaca to, you know, getting a hold of people in Philadelphia, deciding this is going to be a project, deciding this is going to be a documentary? Kind of take me through that process of going from concerned observer to I want to be a storyteller, I want to be a journalist for this story for these people.
Sure. Well, I may be giving myself away here, but a lot of people don't realize that this was actually student film. This
Oh,
was our
okay.
senior thesis. Yeah.
I did
So
not know
my
this. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. So I was a senior at the time, and the way that Ithaca's program worked was when you make your thesis, I mean, it's not a class. You've done everything. You go and make a film, and you act like real professionals. You are filmmakers. So we acted like filmmakers. We went to classes Monday through Thursday, and then Fridays through Sunday, we were in Philadelphia shooting. During the week, we
Wow.
were planning our shoots. So yeah, we were filmmakers for a semester, still doing other classes. How well those went. I graduated. um,
That's cool as hell, though, that you were okay. So you were making this as a student, as
right.
students.
Yes. So when at the time we were pitching ideas for our thesis, and this was on my radar, and I knew that this was what I wanted to make my thesis about. And then that is how I connected with the other filmmakers who worked on this with me. I had known them. The program was small, but we were all working on our thesis. So we ended up coming together, and this was our collective film.
So were they all classmates, or were they in the same major, or were they just in the same school?
They were my classmates at the time. Yeah.
Okay.
And one of them, Kristen, she is also from the area. She actually lives a little closer to Philadelphia than I do. So she also knew that this was going on as well.
Okay. All right. So, but this one was your thesis film. So you were kind of heading it up. Walk me through the process of, was this your first documentary? Now I have a whole bunch of other questions now. Was this one your first documentary, or had you done some shorter form video projects before this one yourself?
Yeah. This was the first one that saw the light of day.
Damn.
I made another short film about urban sustainability in New York City the year before. That never went anywhere. I feel like that will always just be a unfinished work. And then the very first one that I made was about sexual assault in gymnastics. I was paired with a director who actually was a gymnast, and the gym that she had grown up going to had incidents of verbal assault and physical assault. So that one screened, I think, in Chicago and Colorado like once or twice, and then we kind of just let it go.
Okay. Wow. All right. And these were also projects at Ithaca as well?
Yes, those were made when I was a student, but like a very, very baby student who was maybe just touching a camera for the first time.
Okay. All right. I understand. So you did have some practice, some experience prior to this project. How did you decide who would take on which role as far as your team with On the Fenceline? And what role did, I mean, I think I kind of know the answer to this, but what role did you play? Were you kind of the overall like producer / director that was kind of, overseeing the entire project? How many people were on your team? What roles did they play? How did you split up the work? And did you find that over time?
Yeah. I mean, we tried to decide pretty early on, who was going to be doing what. So there were 6 of us who actually started, but there were 4 of us who primarily handled, just like the directing, producing, because there would be times where on like a Tuesday, something would be happening in Philly, and we'd say, okay, these 2 people can skip class and go, so these 2 people are going, and we would do day trips that way.
Wow.
Yeah, so we did things in pairs. So I was just really a producer, but I had a co-producer, but he was also the editor, and he would also double as a cam op sometimes. And then we had 2 cinematographers on like 2 separate teams who would go if we were splitting up for the day. And then they also were editors as well. But for the most part, I was just the producer who did not touch the edit. So I could go in without being super, super close to it as possible as that could be for someone who is working on a film. but I mean, that was super helpful. I mean, I think with this film too, the topic is such a community is just at the heart of it. And for, I don't know, I think I've just been thinking about like how films are made and how you come to, or how you approach certain topics with a singular perspective. And I think with this one, we really had the four of us, each of our perspectives were included and taken into account when we were shaping this and when we were approaching this and as we went on in the filmmaking process. So in terms of the directing, that's kind of how we did that, where maybe like one person would be sitting in the director's chair and then we'd have a person rolling camera, a person rolling sound, and then another director on standby to jump in if anything was missed, to follow up on anything. And that's kind of how it took shape with the role.
So it sounds like it was really a total collaborative team effort, which is, I love that. You know, you were fluid a little bit in your roles, it sounded like you were saying, depending on like if something was going to happen on a Tuesday and somebody needed to get on the road, right, and get out there, it was whoever was available. Yeah, I like that. You know, that's something that, you know, maybe filmmakers that are used to, you know, the structure and the defined roles and something like that, you know, is a foreign concept to them. But I kind of dig that with your collective group.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely did have, I mean, in terms of the technical roles, I mean, those definitely stayed pretty rigid. But in terms of just like the shaping of the story and the interacting with the people who were in our film, I mean, that is kind of something that we all wanted to be a part of, because we all knew that we could, I don't know, extract something differently than one another. Our interactions changed just based on who we were with each of the people that we spoke with. Understood.
This brings something up from your website that I really love. So you mention non-extractive filmmaking for your approach. I'm going to read this from your site and then get some comment. I love that you put this on your site. Our process holds space to reflect often on our identities and biases and how they might shape our decision-making and filmmaking approach. As outsiders, we are conscious of the history of oppressive power between white folks and communities of color, and we continue to seek resources and non-extractive filmmaking practices and environmental racism that might inform our own approach. While two of our directors are from the greater Philadelphia area, their experiences of growing up in their respective communities do not parallel growing up in South Philly. Our four directors do not know the lived experiences of being Black in South Philly. When we traveled to Philadelphia to film, we knew we were showing up to listen. I like this a lot. I'm wondering how the decision came to. Was it a conscious decision always from the go to take this non-extractive filmmaking approach? Was this something that was discussed in class? Was this something that you came up with as a team? And talk about the decision to put this kind of out publicly on your website for the film.
Yeah. So this wasn't something that I actually learned from class, which is part of the reason why I wanted to make sure that it was something that consciously we were practicing as filmmakers. Because I think just generally when people start out, there isn't a certain level of cultural competency, I think, when thinking about the power dynamics of film and filmmaking and the people and subjects that you were portraying. I stepped into this conversation, this industry conversation about power dynamics when I was in North Carolina the summer before I started making this film. I was a fellow at a impact producing nonprofit called Working Films, and a large project that I worked on was their resource called Story Shift, which is trying to educate filmmakers just, you know, that these power dynamics exist, and teaching people how, you know, we can acknowledge and maybe make filmmaking a more collaborative thing. just between people who, you know, are in films and people who are making films. So that is something that I knew that with my thesis, I wanted to practice, because I always have felt like if you want to change something, then you just have to do it. You have to like practice what you preach. So that is a conversation that we had very early on as a group when we were deciding to move forward together. And that's something that we stayed true to, where we had a lot of conversation. You know, I am the only person of color on that filmmaking team, but I'm not Black. I'm Asian. So what I know and the racism that I have maybe experienced is very different from what Black people in Philly have experienced. And also where I grew up, again, very different experience from where people in our film grew up and the experiences that they face every day. So, I mean, part of that is obviously you are always going to question whether or not you're doing the right thing, whether or not you are approaching a certain situation with your biases. But the fact that we just tried to be aware of it every time, you know, every time we stepped into a situation, we'd be like, okay, what is the implication of us including this scene, for example? Like, I think at one point we were riding in a car with someone and we were shooting out the window, and we were in one of the city housing projects in South Philly. And I think that originally was in one of our trailer cuts. And then we were like, hold on, wait a minute. This is just like poverty porn. That is just, you know, rampant. So why don't we actually step outside of that and like try to talk to people about how they see their neighborhoods and what they want us to capture. And part of that is also talking to people about their connections to the neighborhoods, and then really trying to figure out how to capture that in an image.
I love that. It's like, I mean, I love everything you're saying, and it has me thinking like, yeah, like every filmmaker maybe should look into this program and have, you know, that recognition of the lens that they're telling the story through. And I do like what you're saying about the, you know, the total collaboration with the community as well that you're going into, and, you know, many times disrupting, right? And making sure it's all about getting an authentic story, right? It's not even like, you know, it's definitely not to the level of, you know, making a fluff piece or like a marketing promotional, you know, for this region or for these people. It's just about telling it realistically and authentically, and making sure that their voices are coming through, and that the narrative isn't being, you know, molded or manipulated to maybe what the filmmaker. Yeah, it has me thinking like, you know, this is probably not how films have always been made, right? Like, I'm sure we don't have to name them, but I'm sure we both have seen films where in documentaries, say, for example, where, you know, the director, their hands are clearly on the narrative, and maybe they're even inserting themselves into the storyline, and it sometimes maybe feels more like it's about that person and not about the actual you know, subjects and the topics that are in the film. I'm going off on a little tangent there, but I love this approach, and I'm glad that you put that on your website, because it got my attention for sure.
And I mean, I think it's so difficult to separate yourself from a subject too, but I think just even when you're making something, especially if it's about other people, I mean, just thinking about whose voice am I centering in this, especially for like an experience that isn't your own, and how much of what I believe is coming across in what, you know, someone who is completely unfamiliar with this is seeing.
Cinema Activist is produced by Lions Den Productions, hosted by John C. Lyons, music by Tony Gray. Support the efforts of Lions Den Productions by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lions Den Productions. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon.